Hello, it's Jacob again, and in this video we'll be talking about equilibrium. So, in the past several videos, we've gone over demand, we've gone over supply, and we've discussed all the different aspects of what determines what those curves look like, how we interpret the appearance of the curve, as well as some of the factors that can cause the curves to shift. But just a curve by itself is not very useful. Where this material is going to become useful is when we combine both of them into one graph. Now, because supply slopes upwards, that would be our law of supply at work, and because demand slopes downwards, that'd be our law of demand, as long as there is a point where demand is above supply, as long as there is a point where the marginal benefits to the consumer are higher than the opportunity cost of the producer, then these two curves are going to cross, and they will cross at one and only one point. You focus on that graph, you can see if demand is going down, supply is going up, and demand starts above supply, that is, there is some quantity at which the consumer values the product more than the producer, then they must cross. And we have a term for that point, and it's called the competitive equilibrium or competitive market equilibrium. A pair, like any other point along a curve, a pair of a quantity and a price, where the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. The only point at which supply and demand overlap. And the significance of the competitive equilibrium is that in a free competitive market, prices and quantities are going to naturally settle at the competitive equilibrium. What do I mean by free? I mean a world in which people run their own businesses. You have the ability to set your own price. You have the ability to choose whether or not to buy, and so on and so forth. A capitalist society. What do I mean by competitive? That there is more than one seller and more than one buyer. There is more than one consumer, more than one producer. And we're going to see why the price and quantity settles at this point through two scenarios: shortages and surpluses. Now, first, let's suppose if the price were below the equilibrium quantity. Now, by definition, the equilibrium is where quantity supplied and quantity demanded are equal. And so let's imagine what would happen if you were to lower the price. If you lowered that price, then because it's a lower price, the consumer would want to buy more, right? But the producer would want to produce less. If you saw a better deal on a product you wanted, you would not want to buy less of it because it was a better deal. And likewise, if someone were offering to pay you more for something, you wouldn't want to sell less of it. So, starting from equilibrium, lowering the price is going to lower quantity supplied and increase quantity demanded. Now, this presents a problem. You can only buy what someone is actually willing to sell you. And likewise, you can only sell what someone is actually willing to buy. And so of these two numbers, the minimum is going to be the quantity that is traded, the quantity that actually gets bought, actually gets sold in the market. Here, the problem is that with a lower price, the consumer does not, or the consumer wants to purchase more, than the producer is willing to sell. And thus, the quantity traded is going to be lower than it would be at the equilibrium. Now, we have a term for this shortfall, this gap between the quantity supplied and quantity traded, and we call it a shortage. Now, the use of this word shortage, and this applies to a lot of things in economics, we give it a very technical meaning. See, oftentimes, normal people will refer to any situation in which the quantity is reduced as being a shortage. In economics, we don't do that. Shortage very specifically means that people want to buy at the given price, and yet they cannot. It's a situation where people are showing up to the store, but the shelves are empty. Now, if the price were to increase, and so people did not buy as much because of that, because there was some reduction in supply, say, there was some logistical hiccup, that would not be considered a shortage in economics, because all of the goods that are arriving are being sold. But in this scenario, where the price is too low, the price being too low causes the goods to sell out, even though people are willing to purchase more. Now, what will happen with this shortage? Well, note that at the reduced quantity traded, the marginal benefits to the consumer of consuming are higher than the opportunity cost to the producer of producing. This means that the consumer simply values the resources more. And because of that, there is a potential here for mutually beneficial voluntary trade. Because the consumer could offer the producer a price anywhere between their own marginal benefits and the current price, and it would be considered an improvement for both. The consumer would be paying a price less than their marginal benefits, and so they would be benefiting on net. And the producer would be receiving a price higher than their opportunity cost of production, and so they too would be better off. Well, we would expect that this kind of trade would begin to happen. And there's different ways that it could occur. It could be that consumers go to the producer and say, hey, you know, I really wanted more of this specific product, and I'd be willing to pay you more in the future if you would produce it. Or it could be that the producer recognizes that there is a shortage, and so they raise their prices, knowing that the consumer will willingly pay more. Or this could be done with no communication at all. It could instead be done implicitly, just by recognizing that there are empty shelves. The producer understands that they need to increase output. In any case, the producer is going to raise their price. And because they are willing to produce more at a higher price, they're also going to raise output. Now, the consumer, on the other hand, is not willing to purchase as much at a higher price. Their quantity demanded will shrink. But because the quantity demanded started out higher than the quantity supplied, even though their quantity demanded is falling, the quantity traded is still rising. because the shortage shrinks. The price goes up, the consumer does not desire as much of the good, the producer produces more of the good, and so the shortage begins to go away. And then the process repeats. Now, with different goods, you could imagine this process moving at different speeds. In some markets, it's extremely fast. I believe I've mentioned stock markets before. Those are always very fast because stockbrokers sit and watch them like hawks. With other things like, say, durable goods, you might imagine something very bulky and awkward to sell like a car. This process is going to move a lot slower. But with both, you expect that through repeated iteration, the shortage will get smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually there is no shortage at all. I think I have a graph on the next page of that. Yeah, this one's a little bigger. This one will be easier to look at. So the price will just incrementally increase, most likely experimentally, until that shortage disappears and you are back at equilibrium. Now, what happens when you get to equilibrium? Well, at equilibrium, the marginal benefit to the consumer equals the marginal cost. And so nobody is willing to offer anybody a better deal. Consider what would have to happen. Well, if the consumer were to offer a higher price, that price would be higher than their own marginal benefit of consuming the good. They would be left worse off than before. So the consumer is not willing to offer a higher price. And if the consumer offered a lower price, then the producer would not be willing to produce as much as before. The quantity would actually fall. At the equilibrium, because the two are equal to each other, marginal benefits and opportunity cost, the situation is stable. Neither side is able to improve on it. Now, let's look at the reverse. What if the price were to start out higher than the equilibrium price? You'll often find that as we go through these videos, I tend to present one case, and then I present the second case more briefly, because most of these are just reversed. If you understand the logic of one, you can easily understand the logic of the other. Well, if we start at equilibrium, where quantity supplied and quantity demanded are equal, and then we raise the price, then by the law of supply, producers are going to want to produce more. They're getting paid more, so they want to produce more. And consumers, by the law of demand, are going to want to consume less. They have to pay more, so they don't want as much of the good. This pushes the two quantities away from each other. And remember, you cannot sell what somebody is not willing to buy. So if quantity demanded is falling, then the quantity must also be falling. And you wind up with a situation where the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded. Now, we call this situation a surplus. Honestly, there are different ways a surplus could manifest itself. That name implies that the goods are being made, yet they're going unsold. So rather than having an empty shelves situation, people are showing up to the store, but they cannot find what they need to buy. Instead, we have a full shelves situation. Not enough people are showing up and product is going unsold. And make no mistake, that is equally wasteful, perhaps even worse, because scarce resources are being used to produce those unsold goods that benefit nobody. But like the shortage, the surplus is going to automatically correct itself. See, at that elevated price, Mayday, Mayday, 1, 2, 3. Now, nobody wants to be stuck with unsold goods. And so what's going to happen is the producers will begin to bid down the price. They will bid it down by as much as they need to sell off the stock. But then, understanding that they had a surplus, they're going to produce less goods in the future and also sell them at a lower price. At a smaller quantity, the opportunity cost of production is lower, and so they're willing to charge a lower price. They also understand that they need to charge a lower price in order to sell the goods off. And thus, the quantity supplied falls, but with the lower price, the quantity demanded rises. And as the two move closer to each other, the surplus is going to shrink. And so it shrinks, it shrinks, it shrinks until eventually we get back to equilibrium. And once the two are equal to each other, everything that's being made is getting sold, and there is no reason to change the level of output. Now, I like to think of prices and quantities as working like gravity. You can think of the competitive equilibrium as being like a celestial object, and it draws in the consumer and producer. The consumer will shift along their demand curve, and the producer shifts along his supply curve. These are like rails. Imagine a person riding these curves like they're rails. And if the two start out above the equilibrium, then they're going to shift towards the equilibrium. And if the two start out below the equilibrium, they'll also shift towards the equilibrium. And you see that down here. You start out with too low of a price, and they both move towards the equilibrium. They both move towards each other. You start out above, and the same thing happens. And in both cases, the quantity traded rises as the shortage or surplus resolves itself. Now, it's important to note that although the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded move, the supply and the demand do not move. Now, I already brought this concept up a few videos ago, and it will come up again in this video. But as the market equilibrates, as the consumer and producer move towards equilibrium, the supply and demand curves stay the same because the underlying preferences and capabilities of the two have not changed. That relationship of how much do I want to buy, how much do I want to sell at a given price is not altered. The only thing that changes is which price they're responding to. I used that word equilibrate a little earlier than I meant to. But what's meant by equilibrating is this process of getting to equilibrium. Now, the stability of an equilibrium is why we call it an equilibrium. See, equilibrium means basically a situation where things are not changing. And this concept exists in many different fields, many of which, or many of you, uh, would be familiar with some of them. A lot of my students in this class are forestry majors. And so you probably are familiar with equilibrium in ecology. Animal and plant populations naturally increase from, reproduction, and they naturally decrease from predation and from death by natural causes. But eventually, you reach a state of equilibrium in which the populations of all the different animal and plant species are in the proper proportions to each other, that no one population increases or decreases, such as we would see in, say, an old growth forest. Likewise, you might be pre-med, or I think I've had veterinary sciences before. In medicine, you have equilibrium. There we tend to call it homeostasis instead, but you have this process by which the body will step up or step down certain activities, step up or step down the levels of certain chemicals in order to maintain an intended state at which the body needs to operate. Like how our bodies attempt to maintain a certain temperature. And if the temperature rises too high, you sweat. And if the temperature falls too much, you shiver. And equilibrium exists in game theory. Strategic decision-making, strategic in the sense that you're responding to other people who are also making decisions. In game theory, we define an equilibrium as being a situation where everyone has the best strategy, assuming that everyone else also has the best strategy. And so nobody wants to change their plan. Now, in our competitive market equilibrium, it's stable since nobody wants to make anyone a better offer. Nobody is capable of making an offer that would make the other side better off and make themselves better off at the same time. At an equilibrium, if you were to change the price, one side or the other would cut back on their quantity traded, and it would be to the detriment of both. And so we likewise say that this equilibrium is efficient because of that same reason. Everyone's getting the best offer they can. But we'll explore that in more detail a few videos from now when we talk about the gains from trade and how we measure those. For now, I think I'm going to cut this video off here, just to make sure it doesn't run too long. But we'll come back with some examples, or, well, in the next video, we'll talk about how supply and demand shocks create shortages and surpluses, and how those then equilibrate.